Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Dogman WINS, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid back in the 1970s, my father had an ongoing Halloween competition with the dad next door. They both wanted to be king of the suburbs when it came to their Halloween decorations. When it came to Christmas, Dad would just string up a few lights, but when Halloween came around, we always had a huge show going on. Dad figured out how to make objects move remotely. He had zombies hidden in graves on our front lawn, and when people would walk down the block, he would watch from inside secretly. As the neighbor got to the right spot, Dad would hit a button inside, and somehow a fake zombie mannequin would pop up out of the ground and send the neighbor away screaming for their lives. Dad would always laugh so hard that his face would turn red, and he would cough for a while. That would lead to my mother lecturing him that too much happiness was the devil's playground, or something like that, and then they would argue. As soon as the fighting was done, though, Dad was back at his station, waiting for the next fly to walk into his trap. As the years went on, he developed more ways to surprise and scare people, and our home became a place people would visit on purpose at Halloween, looking to be frightened. When the next-door neighbor put a zombie cemetery in his backyard and allowed strangers to come in for free to tour the graveyard, Dad lost his mind. By the next October, he had me help him build a haunted maze in the backyard that had Mom arguing with him twice daily. She was really against the entire idea, but Dad was a man obsessed. He needed to be the suburban king of Halloween. By the time I was 13, Dad's mania had led him to purchasing the property behind our house and demolishing it, thereby creating a direct path from our house to a patch of woods that was either part of the state forest or connected to a state forest. I was never really sure who owned that patch of woods, but now we owned the pathway to it. Dad fenced the place off until Halloween and labored alone like a mad scientist, not even forcing me to help him anymore. Mom grew worried, but I was so happy to not have to spend every afternoon helping my loony dad that I kept telling her Dad was perfectly okay. So when Halloween season opened that year, what was beyond Dad's fence was as much a mystery to me and the family as it was to our neighbors. What we saw was a patch of woods, kind of the same as it had always been, but Dad had a weird, subtle lighting and remains of parts of signs pointing in confusing directions and warning of things that were no longer specified. I looked with wide open eyes at what Dad had created and wished him luck. Then I turned around to leave. This was too scary looking for me, and I wanted no part of it. How had he used lights, yet made the place seem darker somehow? Even today, just thinking about that year's Halloween gives me a twinge of electric fear in my belly. So anyway, Dad didn't let me leave. He grabbed me by the arm and led me into his dark creation. He had a special job for me, he told me. We walked deeper and deeper into the woods. They seemed much larger and more dense than they ever had before. I used to take this shortcut past the old house all the time when walking to the library, but it never seemed frightening until now. It seemed like we walked a mile, and I wondered if I could figure out my way back when Dad said we had reached the spot. There was something furry on the ground, and I recoiled in horror. Dad called me rude names and told me I was acting afraid of my own costume. Costume? I looked, and sure enough, it was an Ewok costume that Dad had altered and put these big fangs into the mouth of. He told me to put the costume on, then hang out behind this bush there and wait for people to walk by. When they did, I was supposed to jump up and down and screech at them. Then they'll run away, said Dad. No, they won't, I said. They'll bop me in the nose for being a little jerk is what they'll do. Dad insisted nobody was going to bop me on the nose, then said that it wouldn't hurt as much to get bopped on the nose anyway if I was wearing the Ewok mask, so I better put it on. Then he left, and I was alone in the forest primeval, dressed as a teddy bear from space with fangs, and hoping that nobody would bop me for being dressed like this. I wondered what I should do. Disobey my dad so that I didn't get people angry at me, or obey my dad so I didn't get a spanking later. It seemed like no matter what I chose to do, I was going to be the loser in the end. That's when I heard a sound in the forest, and my initial instinct was to duck down and hide. I was too scared to be there. I really wanted to go home and watch TV. Assuming it was one of the neighbors, I figured I'd better sneak a peek at them and see if they looked like the kind who would have a good sense of humor or not. So I peeked over the bushes in the direction of the sound, but I did not see a person there at all. I saw a dog. Or maybe it was a wolf or a coyote. It was in the dark in silhouette. I could only make out its head, really. What a relief, at least it wasn't one of the neighbors. I called out to the dog, "Here, puppy." As I watched, the dog turned and saw me. I couldn't see its expression in the dark, but I saw that it was standing up. I thought it was already standing up, so this was a surprise. That dog head rose to the height of a really tall dog. Then it kept on rising higher. The dog stood up like a man, a very, very tall man. That's when I realized it must be someone else my dad had hired to scare the neighbors. I hoped. Nervously, I asked him just that. Was he working for my father? Was he part of the crew? He didn't answer. Or maybe he did, but he didn't answer in words. He answered by growling. If this was an actor, he must have been an award-winning one. I booked it out of there, running toward what I hoped was the direction of my family's house. I could hear the dog or whatever it was tearing up the forest behind me, and I never felt so terrified before. I squealed and ran, pushing past signs and knocking down a few random fake gravestones Dad had placed around. Some kind of real wild animal must have wandered in from the forest. I wasn't sure yet what was chasing me, but I knew it wasn't someone's pet, and it wasn't a person in a costume. Breaking through into my backyard screaming, I hoped someone would help me or give me a place to hide from the monster. Instead, they pointed and laughed. They thought this was part of the show. And why shouldn't they? I ran around the house and stopped around a corner trying to catch my breath. I peeked back and saw the creature in full for the first and only time. It was standing twice as tall as the men, looking down and sort of half screaming and half barking at everyone. It snapped at them and they pulled away, laughing the entire time. They must have thought it was some sort of trick. It didn't look real, and yet there was nothing else it could be. It had the head of a crazed wolf with pointed ears and darker fur than I'd ever seen on wolves before. Despite the dog head, it had the body of a kind of a Sasquatch-looking creature. Or maybe like a dark bear, but it moved much more quickly than a bear and seemed much more used to being on its hind legs than a bear would be. The way it ran wasn't like a dog or a bear or an ape or a human exactly. It just sort of ran like a monster. I decided to try to sneak into the house and hide in the confusion when someone grabbed me from behind, holding their hand over my mouth. I struggled and I kicked hard, which caused a very familiar voice to tell me to cut it out. Looking upward, I saw that it was my father. He snuck me quietly into the house, and we watched from the kitchen window as the Dogman crashed into the woods and disappeared. The crowd applauded as though this were a scheduled performance. My father told me to throw out the Ewok costume and never speak of this again. He then proceeded to go outside and lie to all the neighbors that they had just witnessed an actual werewolf chasing an actual juvenile Sasquatch across his property. Needless to say, he won the Halloween Wars for that year. Or maybe I should say, Dogman won. Don't go away. Right after this break, we've got the Dogman of Austin, Texas.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
The Dogman of Austin, Texas, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. This story actually took place in Mayfield Park, which is a nature preserve. I remembered it being in Austin, but it looks like it might actually be in nearby Tarrytown according to this map I'm looking at. Either way, this story took place when I used to live in Austin in the early part of the 21st century. Now, Austin has a reputation of being weird, and everyone there is very proud of it. But nobody that I ever met the entire time I stayed over there was ever as weird as the Dogman. So like I said, one day I went to Mayfield Park, brought there by a girl who had lived in Austin longer than I had. She wanted to show me her secret place in the park where she liked to sit. She told me she always wished she could sit there with someone else, so I got elected for the gig. When we finally found the area she liked so much, it was not what I was expecting. The area seemed to be built on the edge of a cliff, and there were stone walls to keep you from walking off the edge. The view was remarkable, but that wasn't what she brought me here to see. We walked a few feet away from the wall overlooking the forest far below, and found a bench facing away from the magnificent view. Why would they have built and stationed this bench facing in that direction? There was just a bunch of trees over there. Still, this is where the girl wanted to sit, so I sat with her and then stared at a bunch of trees for a while. She asked me if I didn't love it, and I said I couldn't argue that I didn't. After a while, something shifted. I mean, it felt like everything changed somehow. Maybe the atmosphere changed or the ions in the air became different. It felt like everything suddenly was vibrating at a different frequency, like as though there were a sound present now that wasn't there before. The air tasted differently and everything felt electric. I smelled matches and tasted metal. "Do you feel it?" the girl asked me, and I could see her hair rising around her face. It was floating in the air and rising higher all the time. What was happening? Were we about to get hit by lightning? We both heard a sound from the trees, and immediately both our views were drawn to the small forest in front of us. There, we saw two immense hands reach out and part a couple of medium-sized trees. The hands looked like they were 6 feet off the ground, and the strength they were demonstrating was superhuman in my estimation. Suddenly horrified, I remember backing up on the bench so I was now sitting up on the back of it higher than the girl. Why I didn't run, I'm not sure. I guess I just wanted to see what was going to walk out of those trees. I'm not sure I really should have stayed. I think it might have been a better thing if I never saw what was in those woods, because it wasn't something that made sense either then or now. It wasn't something that could have been there, and yet it was there. My brain and mind are disconnected from each other ever since then. I don't trust my own eyes anymore, even when I'm with someone else who is seeing exactly the same thing. My entire world got turned on its head in that next moment, because when those trees parted, this thing walked out that looked like some kind of demonic, hairy, dog-headed monster. It was angry before it had a reason to be. Then it saw us, and it got angrier. That was my impression of it, that it was nothing but a manifestation of savagery itself. I should have looked away. I should have run. I should have done anything but continue to sit there in the presence of this foul and unholy beast. This was not something that belonged in our world. This was not something it was healthy to be near. So why was I not running? Why was I not walking away? Why was I not at least looking away from it? The girl was saying something, and I realized that the air was so charged it was hard to make out words from her speech. This was almost like an altered state of consciousness, yet it was affecting us both at the same time. I focused on her lips, and it seemed that she was saying, "This isn't the place we really are. We aren't actually seeing this from here." "Where are we seeing this from?" I asked, and the monster screeched in pain and horror. I was hurting it physically by asking questions about it. Nothing was making any sense, and the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning, feeling like I had the worst hangover of my life. I never saw that girl again, so I never got her side of the story. I was told that she moved out with no advance warning, but she had left money to cover her share of the rent, so nobody even bothered her about it. I guess this all happened while I was asleep. Nobody had any info about how I ended up back in my own bed. They looked at me strangely for even asking the question. I guess they all assumed I had a psychedelic experience of some kind. And actually, I guess that most likely they were correct, at least in some way. What is the strange power that the Dogman has over human consciousness. Is it a real thing that actually looks like a werewolf? Or is it something or someone else that only makes us think that it looks like a dog-headed, hairy man monster? Maybe the Dogman isn't just a beast. Maybe the Dogman is some kind of life form far more sophisticated than human beings. Maybe Dogman is a bit too much for us to even understand.
Check out the audio podcast version of Scary Stories NYC, now available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and other popular podcatchers. Bigfoot Attacked My Tiny House. Scary Stories by Peter Bernard, Volume 1, now available on Amazon in paperback.
Come back for more Scary Stories.